If only we just didn't try to deal with death. To be able to handle such a godlike, decision, you live, you die, we don't have a godlike means of being able to arrive at truth.
Anti-death penalty advocate Sister Helen Prejean today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. For more than 30 years, one of the most vocal and one of the most effective campaigners against the death penalty in America has been a Roman Catholic nun from New Orleans. But until 1993, few people in the general public had ever heard of Sister Helen Prejean. That all changed in 1993 when she wrote a book, a best-selling book called Dead Man Walking, which of course became a highly acclaimed motion picture. Leveraging her newfound influence, Helen Prejean pushed forward with her anti-death penalty campaign. She helped co-found the Moratorium campaign, and she set up a group to counsel the families of murder victims. Now, a major part of her effort has always been to prevent the executions of innocent defendants, who very often are caught up in a sea of legal technicalities. In 2004, Helen Prejean wrote a second book called The Death of Innocents, which followed the stories of two men who were executed despite what she believed was their innocence. Now, she and I talked about this book in early 2005, actually. We hadn't talked since 1993. In just a moment, our conversation.
They say what's old is new again. You're about to see if that's true as you listen to an interview from noted radio personality Bill Thompson's 30-year archive. Enjoy.
So here now from 2005, Sister Helen Prejean.
Is this logically considered a sequel to Dead Man Walking, or is this simply taking the discussion to the next logical higher level?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not considered a sequel. I didn't know the book was going to happen myself because I accompany one person at a time on death row, and it ended up that the last two people that I had been with, I believe, were innocent. And I said, wow, their stories need to be told. And then also the court system that's upholding this system where you can have so many, nationally in the United States now, 117 wrongfully convicted people have come off of death row. So we got some faults in the system. Most people don't have a clue because they're not close to it. I am. I'm watching people be killed, executed by the state. I'm learning about the court system and that upholds it and why it's not going to take a quick fix like DNA to just straighten everything out, because that only applies in 1 in every 4 murder cases anyway. So and so when you accompany people and watch them be killed in front of your eyes, and Dobie Gillis Williams, the first one in the book, and then Joseph Odell, you got to do something, and so that's how this book came to be.
Do you suppose most Americans are under the impression, as I think you said at the outset that you were at one point, that if they're on death row, they must be guilty? Because Look at all the appeals, the process. The governor and the legislature, the courts and the Supreme Court, they've got to be guilty if they're on death row.
No, I do think a lot of people think that. And, people are not very knowledgeable of death row situations or the death penalty. It's mostly sound bites they hear about. And most people, it's a knee-jerk reaction. People did those terrible crimes. They deserve to die. The death penalty is not something the American people reflect on very much. And so when I wrote Dead Man Walking, which came out in 93, and then Susan Sarandon called me, and we met together, and she said, we need a film to bring this subject to a deeper reflection. Boy, I went for it. And so now this book takes a reflection deeper, because honorable people may disagree about whether or not some people who have done unspeakably horrible crimes, and we know they're guilty, can be executed. But who would agree that we can also execute the innocent?
That's the heart of your whole book, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Plus, people have to understand, though, why we can't fix it. See, because one of the things that comes out very clearly in this book is the regional disparity in the practice. Over 80% of executions happen in 10 southern states that practice slavery the longest. And so the legislature, for example, in Louisiana, is never going to legislate giving enough money to defense attorneys to, that take on capital defendants. Because of the politics, because of they're going to go, these people. One district attorney said, isn't it bad enough they presumed innocent, so we got to take all this trouble to prove their guilt anyway? I mean, they're never going to put the money into it. And what this means, and this is why we have so many mistakes, this is why 117 people have been freed from death row, saved by citizens, by Innocence projects, by, we talking college students who go in and do what the defense never did in the first place. I feel bad for the jurors, too. They're just citizens, and they asked to play God. They don't have all the information they need anyway.
They rarely see all the evidence, do they?
No. And I mean, of course they don't. They don't see all the evidence. And the reason is we have a structural fault in the system. Because to get truth at trial, you have to have a true adversarial system of arriving at truth. Prosecution presents testing, forensic testing. Defense presents defensive testing. Prosecution presents eyewitnesses. Defense presents eyewitnesses and alibis. But if you got no defense, Joseph Odell, the second person in this book in Virginia who defended himself, said it was like the L.A. Rams against the high school varsity team. What suffered in that? The truth didn't come out at trial. And so the jurors, doing their best from what they had, decided. And they decided he should die. And now he's been executed. And then the state of Virginia destroyed the DNA evidence so that it would never be tested again. And this is what we're left with. We don't have to be doing this. That's what I'm saying in this bill. In the death of innocence, we don't have to be doing this. States have in place now long-term imprisonment. Most states have life without parole to protect ourselves against dangerous people so that we don't have to get ourselves involved in this quandary. The Supreme Court has added to the morass because they've given them an impossible guideline, not ordinary murders, but the worst of the worst. Police. Somebody has their mother murdered or their son murdered, one person murdered. Who could ever bring themselves to use the word ordinary crime when you've lost a loved one who can never be replaced? And so jurors, I mean, it's inscrutable. How do we even do this? And then you look at, in practice, the climate in the South. In these southern states, Texas did half of all the executions in the United States in 2004. Then you have a Supreme Court that says equal justice under law, emblazoned on their building. Equal justice under law, and less than 1% of all executions have happened in the Northeast and over 80% in the South. There are no guidelines. There's no rudder on this ship that guides this. Let's just acknowledge. The working title of this book, all while I was working on it, 5.5 years, only changed at the end, was Impossible Burden. Jurors can't handle it. We can't handle it. Prosecutors get under pressure. They start hiding some things or pull in a jailhouse snitch to do the slam dunk on this, as happened in Joseph Odell's case. Surprise witness comes in. And then I end that story because he calls me on the phone crying, saying, I had Joseph Odell killed. I lied, to benefit myself personally, and now he's dead. And now what do? I'm retired, and Joe keeps coming in my living room. But by telling the story to the American people, by bringing them close, because they're never going to see an execution, they're never going to get close to this. And the death penalty is not one of the moral issues people give a lot of reflection to, because it doesn't hit most people personally. Thank God that people don't have somebody murdered and they're going to have to deal with this. If you can bring them close, though, and you can give them pertinent information, like, did you know that less than 2% of all the people who commit murder anyway are that the death penalty sought, and overwhelmingly in certain patterns by certain people, and that legally we don't have a way to do it. It's inscrutable, the guidelines, and then in practice we're not really doing what law is supposed to do. Is supposed to have a reasonable amount of predictability if something is the law. And the only predictability we have in here is when victims are white. Race plays a part in this. Overwhelmingly 8 out of every 10 people are there because they kill white people. When people of color are killed, roughly half of the homicide victims in this country the death penalty isn't sought. So you have racism in its application. Some victims' lives evidently are more highly prized than others, and it correlates with race. Poverty, and you get poor defense. And I think we have to start looking for another paradigm in which to solve social problems other than just thinking violence. We'll use violence and coercion, and that's the way we'll deal with these social problems.
After this short break, Sister Helen Prejean talks about another widely held misconception.
Are you enjoying this conversation so far? And would you like to get a copy of the book we're talking about?
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website heardeverything.com.
When you make a purchase through our affiliate links, you're also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2005 conversation with Sister Helen Prejean.
Well, maybe we should talk about another misconception that people may have, and that is that I think a lot of people think that once you're put on trial and the evidence has been presented, you've been found guilty and you've been sentenced, if you need to appeal that to protect your rights and possibly free an innocent man, you just open up the box of evidence again, show it to somebody else.
That's what I thought.
And no, I mean, people will be shocked to learn that once the evidence is presented, it gets put in a box, it gets put on a shelf in some warehouse somewhere, and nobody ever sees it again. All the appeals courts consider is, did you file this thing with the right clerk with the right stamp on it? And did you put the proper words in the proper order? What kind of justice is this?
No, you're right. And, I didn't know this, but for a federal appeal, they only can use as fodder, if you will, for that appeal in the federal courts what the state Supreme Court ruled in direct appeal. And take Joseph Odell, the second story in this book. His lawyers typed one wrong word on the cover letter, and they said, instead of petition for appeal, motion for appeal. And the state Supreme Court of Virginia refused to look at any of the issues of his case. And one of the consequences of that is no federal court then had anything to look at. And he's ratcheting down toward execution in Virginia, and that's one of the reasons why. And when Justice Harry Blackmun, Supreme Court Justice, after 20 years of being on the Supreme Court, finally began to dissent and saying he'd no longer be part of the machinery of death, it was because he saw the courts increasingly protecting themselves through procedural maneuvers instead of looking at the issues. And one of the opening epigraphs of this book is a quote from Jesus saying, you strain out gnats and swallow camels while neglecting the weightier matters of justice and mercy. And so when you get into the appeals courts, that's not endless appeals. You begin to look at, filed one day late. And my image is the judges in the courts, and especially on the Supreme Court too, have so many pairs of gloves on through procedures. They never touch the human face or the issue.
And maybe the movies have convinced us that all it takes is one person to show up with one piece of new evidence, and everybody says, "Sure, let's have a new trial."
That's
it doesn't work that way.
No, it's like it's like those turnstiles, where the gate clicks behind you and you can't go back. I learned, for example, and I learned this from the beginning in Dead Man Walking, Patrick Saulnier's case, but in this one too. If your defense attorney doesn't raise a formal objection when something's going on, then the courts uphold it because they said you strategized that together and you decided to go that way. So when you have poor defense, which most people in southern states do, then because your defense attorney didn't raise it, Dobie, Gillis Williams, black man, African-American man with an IQ of 65, first story in this book, The Story Breaks Your Heart. His defense attorney did not object while an all-white jury. A white woman had been killed in her bathroom. Here's a young black man on trial for his life, white jury being assembled, and he doesn't object to it. And so every appeals court in the country, when they look at the constitutional right Dobie had to an impartial and fair jury of his peers, do not find that his constitutional right has been violated because the lawyer didn't object.
I suppose from the court's legal system's standpoint, if you opened up every conceivable case to endless, revisitation by a jury and looking at the evidence again. All you would be doing is hearing cases from 10, 15 years ago.
Well, you're right. And it's called abuse of the writ. And they have to protect themselves, and that's why they put these things in. But boy, when you're talking about a person's life, though, see, if only we just didn't try to deal with death, that we can kill people. Because you do make mistakes. Every system's fallible, but at least if you're not killing a person, there may be a way later down the line.
Yeah, if you do 5 years in prison, that's a terrible tragedy, but at least you're still alive when you come out.
Yeah, but to be able to handle such a godlike, decision, you live, you die, we don't have a godlike means of being able to arrive at truth. And I opened the book with this epigraph from a death row inmate, Jimmy Glass, who was executed in Louisiana, and he was a poet, and he wrote this poem, "The earthen vessel may hold the rarest wine, the hand-wrought silver goblet gall," and it ends with, "The truth arrives disguised, therein the sorrow lies." And I think that's true about the death penalty system in the United States.
You wrote in the introduction to this book that one of your most proud moments in the birth of this book was the day at Random House when your editor said, "Dead Man Walking started the dialogue." I'm paraphrasing him. "Dead Man Walking started the dialogue. This book will put an end to the death penalty." I'm paraphrasing him very broadly, but that's essentially what he was saying.
And the whole challenge has been to get the conversation going about the death penalty, getting people reflecting more deeply on it. Why this shows like this are good. You're getting out to people on their radios and their cars, wherever they are and all. And web pages are good because the internet is the way you get a lot of information and all. And dialogue and discourse and reflection are everything. And so how do we get it going? And so it was why I was glad Susan Sarandon wanted to do the film, that she prevailed upon Tim Robbins for 9 months before she could get him to read the book of Dead Man Walking, but that opened up that conversation. And Dead Man Walking, the book, now is all over the country, using it in classes. Conversation, dialogue, let's learn about this. Is this really what we want to do? Because, probably the death penalty is one of the most controversial issues and emotional. Here's what I found, that most people are deeply ambivalent about the death penalty. On the one hand, we're outraged over the death of innocent people, which we should be. I mean, outrage is a legitimate way to feel when we hear about what has happened to innocent people killed, But then on the other hand, people know on one hand you can barely trust government to get the potholes filled, but to set up a system here. And where you put it on the citizens. I tell the story of the anguished juror in Louisiana who he gave in to pressure. Once you close that door behind you and you need to get 12 people agreeing on a death sentence, and he didn't think Robert Sawyer should die, but he gave in to pressure and he went along with it. Then when competent attorneys got on the case in the post-conviction part and he found out about, the mental problems that Robert Sawyer had, the brain damage, all that, it was too late. And the night Robert Sawyer was executed, he called the lawyer, Nick Trinacosta, weeping, and just said, I did the wrong thing. I gave in to pressure. I tell my son, never give in to pressure. What poor jurors are behind those doors, and there's pressure on them to come to a unanimous decision for death or life. What if we just, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we could end this whole thing. We could just say, death is not going to be on the table. Yes, we need to protect ourselves from dangerous people and violent people, but that's what prisons are for, and let's take death off the table.
Sister Helen Prejean is 86 now. Based in New Orleans, she continues to travel the nation campaigning against the death penalty. Now you can get your copy of The Death of Innocence by Sister Helen Prejean by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my 1993 conversation about Dead Man Walking with Sister Helen Prejean.
I'm opposed to people killing each other, period. No one has a right to kill another human being and to use violence.
and my 1994 conversation with the woman who was Ted Bundy's last lawyer before his execution, Polly Nelson.
It's easy to show compassion for people that are deserving, but true compassion is shown when the subject is undeserving, and Ted seemed the least deserving of all.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, you know him best perhaps as Jay Peterman from Seinfeld. We'll revisit my 2010 conversation with actor John O'Hurley.
A man that I met late in my life said, John, you got two choices in life. You can have an ordinary life, or you can have an extraordinary life. There's everything to do with the power of your choices.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.